morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning.
Everybody's so quiet when I say that. Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing today? Welcome to Coffee Talk. We are your hosts, Southborough Youth and Family Services. My name is Sarah Castle. I am the Director of Southborough Youth and Family Services. And with me this morning, we have Megan Island, who's our Assistant Director. Good morning, Megan.
Morning.
We have Shannon Knyman, who is our Program Coordinator. Good morning, Shannon.
Good morning.
And we are also very excited to welcome Dr. Safdar Medina on the show today. Dr. Medina is a Southborough resident as well as a physician, and we're excited to talk to him in a little bit about substance use and the impact of substance use on our community and our youth. So good morning. Thank you for being here, Dr. Medina.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Good morning.
Morning.
I always like to see Megan's coffee mugs. She's got owls today.
Yeah.
Last week you were sort of a cat when you drank out of your
Yes.
coffee
Oh,
mug.
yeah.
It was good for Halloween.
Yes. Well, happy November, everyone. It's a new month. Today happens to be election day. We're not even going to touch that subject if we know what's good for us. But how was everybody's Halloween? Did anybody have a typical Halloween, or was it sort of different this year?
Uneventful on my front.
Uneventful on your front. Yeah.
Very uneventful. We lined up all these Ziploc bags full of candy and really had just a handful of takers. Not even like an older child who would grab like a whole bunch of them. Like we literally have all this candy over.
Oh, goodness. Christina, who's our admin assistant, was just talking about how her kids literally have like 4 times the amount of candy they usually do because so many people were giving out Ziploc bags of candy, and there were 6 pieces for each child, whereas typically you take 1.
Yeah.
So she's got boatloads of candy that she doesn't know what to do with now, but we didn't really do much. We had a get together with a family we spend time with, and they had we did a piñata full of Halloween candy. So
Pinata's fun.
Yeah. How about you, Shannon? What was your Halloween like?
So our town generally does a big Halloween. It's a lot of fun because we're pretty rural. So the people in the center of town do the trick-or-treating, and we all donate candy to those houses, and everybody hangs out, and it's like this mini Salem kind of. It's great, but they canceled it for this year. So some neighborhoods had smaller trick-or-treating, and for us, we live on, our driveway isn't a quarter of a mile long, but it's almost. So we don't have a neighborhood. So we had our kids trick-or-treat at the house. I took a laundry basket full of hats and masks and costumes and anything that I could think of, and put it in the driveway, and then had them come to the door in a new thing every time. And then we give them candy. My husband last did for about 5 times, and then he was like, "Here's my candy, I'm all done." But it was fun. One of the boys came to the door in the same outfit twice, and I was like, "I saw you," and shut the door in his face.
That's good.
Yeah. And they both said, they were like, "That was really fun, and we'll remember that." So
yeah, that's great. You got to make them work for their candy.
Yeah,
right.
Just hand it out to them.
That's right.
That's so funny. That's
great.
It's good that they were good sports about it. I could picture my kids being like, "Oh, can you just give it to me? But I don't want to do this." That's great. Well, so today's topic is about substance use, substance abuse, and in particular, we wanted to highlight that on today's show because it's something that's of concern in general anyway. But in particular, I think during this pandemic, it's been of increasing concern. And Dr. Medina is part of the Northborough Southborough Substance Abuse Prevention Coalition with us, but he also um, plays many roles in our community. So why don't we start there, Dr. Medina? Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and the different roles that you play in our community?
Sure, thank you. So my first and foremost title is I'm a general pediatrician for UMass Memorial. I work in Uxbridge, and I have a strong interest in behavioral health and especially in substance use in adolescents. And so one of my big goals is always to work on prevention. And that's something that we are now doing in our clinic and piloting in other clinics where we're trying to screen every adolescent 13 and above with a detailed questionnaire for substance use. Because my firm belief is we have to start early in catching kids before they start using. And then within our district itself, I'm also the physician for our school district. So trying to work in collaboration with both the middle and high schools, especially, and maybe even as young as elementary school to make substance use more of a part of our platform of discussion in all venues. And more particularly focus on education and prevention within the school setting as well. We were going to try to screen our high school students this year through the state SBIRT program, but of course, because of COVID, we couldn't do that. But that's something that I'm hopeful we can do next year.
I remember talking to one of the school adjustment counselors about that last year, and I remember they had started trying to use SBIRT as a screening tool. That sounds like a really, I appreciate you highlighting the prevention piece, because I agree that it's really one of where we get the most bang for our buck in terms of being able to prevent future subsequent issues with substance abuse. So hopefully we can pick that back up at some point to continue doing screenings with high school students.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think that topic is incredibly important to our discussion today, is that substance abuse has always been an issue, particularly for youth and now for everyone. But, what do you, why should we be paying closer attention to it right now because of the pandemic, do you think, Dr. Medina?
Yeah, absolutely. There's two reasons why. Number one is that we're, because of the pandemic, we're seeing a rise in mental health illness in both adolescents, actually very young children, adolescents, and in adults. And we particularly know in our vulnerable teenage population, or a young teenage population, they look to substances for self-medication. And when they do that, they actually look at the three gateway drugs: nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana. And that is how most addiction starts, is with one of those three gateway drugs. So it is really, something we have to keep our eye on. And as with adults, the coping of stress has been incredible for many adults, whether it's financial, whether it's educational, in trying to balance work and, assisting in their children's education when they're learning remotely. There was a recent study of Johns Hopkins that showed the average adult is now drinking 8 more alcoholic beverages a month than they were before. And really a lot of those adults were adults that did not drink as much beforehand, and they did report that having their children home to remote learn was a big stress. With regards to adolescents, we were probably starting to collect data now, but a really good study of Ontario, Canada, where they actually had kept nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana on sale even during their first lockdown. They found that while they didn't have a lot of new users of these substances, the kids that were using started to use much more, started to use alone, and actually started to engage each other online and use online together because of lockdown. So definitely some troubling patterns did emerge. And as a result of the pandemic, I think we're going to expect those to continue. In my own practice, where we're screening with using SBIRT, what we're using is something called the CRAFT 2.0N tool. And that's something people can look up. It's CRAFFT 2.0N. And it's something that we have teenagers fill out confidentially. Because that way and we know that when they fill something out, they're more likely to be truthful And then we have a discussion about it. And I'm always amazed because when they're checking off a positive for nicotine, alcohol, or marijuana, it's not just checking the box, but they have to put in the number of days. That number of days has been increasing. Some will say 40 days in the past 3 months, or some will say 365 days in the past year. So that trend is definitely being seen.
Mm.
That was interesting to me because you had told me that recently, that not only is our youth and everyone still able to get their hands on substances, but that partying is still happening.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And really what's concerning is that, you can do it online. And of course, for
Right.
many teenagers, the loneliness that they've experienced is driving them to socialize in not only COVID unsafe situations, but unsafe situations regarding substances as well.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
So, Dr. Medina, can you tell us a little bit about what happens physiologically when a person develops an addiction? And also, how can we tell when substance use has gone from just typical use to an addiction?
Great. That's a great question. So basically, anytime we use a substance, and I focus more on the gateway ones because that's my area of prevention. But of course, we're looking at not just the 3 gateway drugs, but other drugs as well. Our brain will get a quick surge of dopamine, and that dopamine surge is something our brain always remembers. And so that brain wants to feel that immediate pleasure and that dopamine surge. And if it was from a drug, then your brain is constantly going to crave that drug over and over again. And as you develop a dependence to it, you then need more and more to receive that same dopamine surge. So people tend to use more and more just to get their surge as they move on. And in adolescence, your brain is much more vulnerable to that addiction than it is when you're an adult, which is important to keep those kids away from these substances. And it's particularly an issue where teens are starting to self-medicate for depression and anxiety, because then they really feel better once they do something, and that their brain constantly remembers that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine it has something to do too with, I think this is one of Shannon's next questions actually, was about, how it's a concern for, as you highlighted, both adults and youth, but in particular, are there reasons to be more concerned about youth? And you're just reminding me, in thinking about mental health, that coping strategies are depleted right now. Especially for young people, I think, we as adults, we can at least get in a car and maybe drive somewhere to get space from our families, or just, change the scenery. We have more freedom, more choices. But I imagine for young people, their ability to cope as easily, or find new avenues of coping, they feel a little more stuck. So they have that, lots of stressors, but then they also have limited access to other more positive coping strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's become more and more of an issue now during the pandemic, whereas, obviously there's been a huge effort to try to keep kids in school and give them sports and give them other things that are very positive in their lives, but it is definitely not available to all kids. And even if it is, it's not the same. So they definitely are craving for that. In addition, we try to identify kids with mental health issues before they even can go down that road of substance use. But, right now during the pandemic, it is very hard for them to learn those coping skills. A lot of them don't learn well remotely. And a lot of the, most clinicians are doing things remotely. So it is a very challenging time. And it is much easier for an adult to do yoga or meditate for 15 minutes, but it is not for a teenager. There's no immediate gratification in that, which is what they're looking for.
And there's something with the teenage brain too, that makes it so much, it's obviously not healthy for any of us to be misusing substances, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Like what is it about a teenage brain that makes it that much scarier, or that much?
Sure. So, that prefrontal cortex that's responsible for that decision making, that analytic decision making, that processing information just doesn't develop. In fact, it develops till you're 25 years old. So, the idea that this may affect me later on in life, or this is harmful for me, that processing is still going on. So that immediate gratification is right there. Whereas an adult, over the years, our prefrontal cortex has developed to know that what I do now may affect me later in the future, or what I do now has consequences.
Hmm. How about that question about, about when do you become concerned? When does it go from use to addiction? Because I think, there are people that don't drink alcohol, for example, or who don't use marijuana or nicotine. But by and large, a lot of adults use. And I think, as you highlighted early on, adults with alcohol in particular are drinking a lot more. And I guess the question on the table is, when does it go from general use of substances to an addiction?
That's a great question. And sometimes there's not a fine line between use, especially when it comes to our youth. But, if I have a patient who has tried, who went to a party and drank a lot of alcohol, came home and did this and maybe repeated it again, that's a red flag already. But is that substance, whatever that substance is, starting to affect their daily life? Like, have they now, I'll take an adolescent example. Are they now seeing a decline in their grades because they've been using too much marijuana? Or is the vaping now causing them not to be able to run as fast as they could because the effect on their lungs? Are they somebody who, is going to the school bathroom to do something? That's a problem. That's problematic. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking for kids, and in a way hoping that they see the effect on them right now so that it doesn't become more of a dependence or an addiction later on in life. But often in teenagers especially, we'll start with that, even that first, experimentation time to go over this, to say this is then dangerous to your brain, because it could affect you in all these ways. But those are the signs, troubling signs that we're looking for.
Reminds me so much of what we talk to families about with regard to mental health, because we all have emotions, right? We all experience stress, but when does it go from what's in the realm of typical human experience to perhaps a diagnosis or a disorder? And we often talk with families about how is the individual functioning? Are their grades being impacted? Just like you just said. So I think that's a nice thing to highlight, because I think that's the question we hear most often with regard to mental health or substance abuse is, how do I know that this has gone over to a side that I should probably pay closer attention and maybe I need treatment or help? So functioning, how is the person functioning? How is it impacting their lives? For sure.
And sometimes that questioning has to be very detailed, because sometimes people do not realize it immediately. And I'm sure you find this too in your work, whether it's someone coping with anxiety or depression. If I have, someone who is smoking vaping nicotine, it is really hard sometimes to say. You really have to say, so tell me how fast you ran, or how well you played in your soccer game, or tell me how much you've been coughing, and really, really outline that. Because to that individual, it may be obvious to us when we ask them, but it's not obvious to them right away. I'll see a lot of teenagers who are using marijuana who develop the gastrointestinal symptoms, vomiting and bellyache every day, but haven't made that association yet that it's affecting. So it really, really, it is challenging work too, as well as you already know.
Yeah, or I imagine too, it's so gradual that it becomes their normal, and they don't, they almost need a snapshot of themselves before they started using to recollect, in order to realize and appreciate how different their lives are or functioning is.
Absolutely. Sometimes the trickier ones are where they may have some symptoms, but their grades aren't affected and life is really good. And those, I think, are the more challenging ones. But again, we try to zone in on those one or two things that have impacted their lives.
Mhm.
Because sometimes it's very hard to tell a high functioning teenager that they're drinking every weekend is problematic for them when they're not seeing it in their daily lives. To tell them that you might get liver damage when you're 50 years old doesn't work for them at that moment. So it's really
Mhm.
No.
difficult. But even for them, there's got to be something that you can find.
Mhm. Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
So we like to, in order to be able to talk about sort of solutions, and this isn't an easy thing, but what would you say we could do preventatively as individuals, as family members, to prevent or combat addiction from starting in the first place? And then, a follow-up question to that is what to do once you are sure that in fact there is an addiction.
Good, great question. So the first thing is, one thing to really remember is kids really value their parents' input. In fact, studies have shown this, that when you ask children or teenagers who the primary influence for their alcohol drinking was, they will say their parents. They actually say that. And so really making sure that from the youngest of an age, from when our children are really, really young, to remember some of those casual things that we say that are probably harmless. Kids, for example, I did a glass of wine today because I had a bad day, or
Yeah.
how we talk about nicotine, or how we talk about, oh, so and so used marijuana, the medicine. Well, kids remember that, and they remember it very well. So one of the key things is how we talk about substances at home is important, and to have those honest discussions immediately. So talk about adults drinking responsibly when they're older, talk about the teenage brain. I think the more factual information we give kids, the better. And to tell them that you're not coming from a place of preaching, you're coming from a place from caring, that I really care about your brain development and your physical health. And, when we know that when you start using when you're young, that's much more of a risk for addiction. And I think that helps frame it that way. And I think always remember that if they have made a mistake, they went out with friends or something happened and they drank or they smoked, just to know that you're not going to punish them, that you're going to understand and you're going to work with them so they understand that really it's just because I care about you and I love you. It's not because you did something bad and I'm going to punish you. I think kids really need to know that parents are on their side for it. Now, obviously, we want to be in tune, like you said, if our child is using, and that's where you're looking for changes in behavior, grades. Suddenly you're getting a note that, so-and-so isn't focusing in school from a teacher has noticed something. I really find, if a teacher sends an email about a change in behavior in your child, that's really important to really zone in on. The first thing you want to do is just talk to them and have that honest discussion that I just want to know what's going on. I'm not going to get you in trouble. This is just so we can work to help you. Parents ask, should I search their room? I think you need to be careful when you do, because that breaking of that trust, once that trust is broken, it's hard to get back. So I think talking to them first is the most important thing. If there is a lot of resistance and you want to look in their room, but then come back and know that they've been using something and then talk to them again. I think it's really, really important not to violate their privacy as much as possible, but be on the lookout and be vigilant at the same time, and always seek help immediately. I mean, talk to their primary care doctor. Referrals are out there, and I think for adolescents especially, there are a lot of clinicians who are trained now in a model called ACRA. It's called the Adolescent Community Reinforcement Approach, that will guide teenagers through their reasons for using substances. It's 14 weeks, once a week. So it's really not a huge time commitment, especially now because it can be done virtually. And a lot of success comes out of that before this becomes more of a problem. So, those are the kinds of things. I also will point out some people, feel a little uncomfortable discussing maybe their own struggles or struggles in a family member. but I think it's important that our kids know that, addiction is genetic. This is a medical illness. Your brain may be more vulnerable if you have a family history of alcoholism. And I think it's really important for kids to know that as well.
Mhm.
Talking is so important. I mean, before I came to youth and family, I came from a family planning background. And that was something that just we talked about all the time. And it's any of these topics that, that are taboo. So whether it's drugs and alcohol, whether it's sexuality, whether it's mental health, that if you're talking about those things, I think a lot of people don't want to talk about these subjects because they think they're putting ideas in kids' heads.
Mhm.
And the research just shows that the more we talk, the more that we have these conversations, the better the outcomes.
Mhm.
So it's important as parents for us to be having these conversations honestly and often. So
Mhm. Mhm. And I like to echo Dr. Medina's point about making sure that, we are using factual information.
yeah.
I think sometimes parents have, or we in general have great intentions, but to make sure that we know, what we're offering. And if we don't know the information, that we're at least listening, we're showing that we are comfortable with the conversation so that it encourages our children to come back to us and talk to us about these subjects. But that if we don't know all of the information together, we go look for it, by seeking help from a professional or talking to, your child's pediatrician or if it's for yourself, your own doctor, absolutely. In our last couple of minutes, are there any, you mentioned ACRA, adolescent community reinforcement approach. Megan and I have both had that training, and we will echo your support of that curriculum. It's evidence-based treatment for young people to receive support around substance use disorders. Are there any other resources that we should highlight or suggestions you have for somebody? If we're at the tipping point where we know it's no longer a question of whether there's an addiction or not. It's we have an addiction here, and what do we need to do about it?
So there are definitely some different levels. So there's some people who need acute detox because if they don't use their substance, they're going to go into withdrawal. And that's for alcohol, for opioids, for a lot of kids are unfortunately abusing prescribed medications such as benzodiazepines like Xanax, or stimulants like Adderall. So those kinds of things actually need acute detox. And there are residential programs for detoxification. There's Spectrum, there's AdCare, there's a few others. But we always say go through a referral person first, like your primary care doctor. If you have a mental health clinician already, go through them before you take that next step. A lot of guidance that's needed for those programs. Some do not take patients under the age of 18 also. So there's definitely, some guidelines there that need to be followed. And then there's a level after detoxification of, what is really intense residential treatment, intense outpatient treatment, where you're not quite ready to go back to your normal daily life as you knew it, but where you need day-to-day guidance and therapy. And sometimes that can be done over a 2 to 3 month period, and sometimes that can be done as an outpatient as well.
That's great. I'd like to remind people, we talked at the top of the show, mentioned it a couple of times, that Dr. Medina, as well as our staff here, are part of the Northborough Southborough Substance Abuse Prevention Coalition. In my head, I'm saying prevention, 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 because it just, of course, we want to provide treatment and support to people who are already experience difficulty with an addiction. But when we focus our time and attention on prevention, it really goes such a long way. And so, investing our time as a community into those programs is really important. So I'll plug our Northborough Southborough Coalition here. If you have an interest, if you're a community member, if you're a resident that just wants to learn more, if you work for the town, this is again Northborough and Southborough together. So if you're a Northborough resident watching this and want to get involved, please feel free to contact either Youth and Family Service Department in Southborough or Northborough to find out more about how to get involved. Or if you have other specific questions about needs that you or someone in your family has, different resources that you're looking for, and we haven't touched upon it, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to get you connected to what you need. So Dr. Medina, thank you so much for coming on the show today. You're an incredible resource for our community, and we're so appreciative that you carved out some time to be with us this morning. Next week, we should be hearing from a young man named Cole. Cole is a young man who's in recovery himself, and he has taken his journey and used it for good. He has been supporting other young people. He has agreed to come on our show to talk about his experience, and we're so happy that he is willing to do that with us. I think it reminds me a lot of our conversation with Eileen Dawson a couple of weeks ago about mental health, that your testimony is the key to someone else's prison, that that's such a gift that you can give to others. So we hope to see Cole next week on November 10th. So thank you again for coming, and thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.